Hello and welcome to Daily Debrief, your primer on some of the most pressing international issues of the day, brought to you by People's Dispatch. I'm Siddhantani, and today we'll be talking about the ongoing coup in Sudan, the crackdown on Palestinian rights groups, Turkey's punitive action against ambassadors from European countries, and we'll even be getting Prashant to talk a little bit of cricket in the context of the Indian cricket team's decision to take a knee in solidarity with the Black Lives Matter movement. First up, Sudan, which is a developing story. The military has reportedly launched a coup and has detained Prime Minister Abdullah Hamdok and other civilian officials on Monday. The coup has taken place amid rising tensions between civilian sections and the military, which have been sharing power in the country since mid 2019. Massive protests had deposed longtime ruler Omar al Bashir. We're joined by Prashant, of course. Welcome back to the show, Prashant.
Thank you.
What's the latest you're getting from the ground in Sudan?
Siddhant, like you said, it's in developing stories. The situation is really fluid. What is important to note is that there is a huge amount of popular anger against this coup attempt, and we've been following the story very closely, and we know that in September as well, there were indications that something like this might happen. There was an attempt by a group of officers on September 21st. On September 26th, security was withdrawn from a key government building. At each of these points, people took to the streets, and this has been the biggest attempt by the military since for between 2 years to actually change the situation. So what we're seeing is that there have been calls for people to come out onto the streets. The news, of course, is that Prime Minister Abdullah Hamdok, key members of his government, are probably detained. Abdullah Hamdok probably being detained because of the fact that he did not support the coup. So what the military has been trying to do is basically you split the civilian establishment against itself. Get some people to sort of say that the coup is necessary for stability and security of Sudan. On the other hand, the people's movements, the people's organizations on the ground, which were in the forefront of this whole process for the past few years. You mentioned Omar al-Bashir. Omar al-Bashir was overthrown. We'll come to that a bit later.
Yeah.
But because of popular protests. So these movements, which include the Sudanese Professionals Association, that's a conglomerate of trade unions. There is the Sudanese Communist Party, which is very active in this. There are the resistance communities, which are the neighborhood organizations, which were formed to basically defend the gains of what is called the Sudanese Revolution. All these groups very determined that they will not let this military coup come to pass, that they will not let this military coup succeed. So like I said, there have been multiple calls for people to come out onto the streets. I think what you're going to see is it won't be that easy for the military. That is what it looks like as of now. It's still very early to say. It won't be very easy for the military to sort of just take over power as it is, because this is something the protesters have been very concerned about for a long time. They've always been worried. In fact, in one of our recent stories, one of our sources from the Sudan said that it's either going to be a full-fledged dictatorship or a full-fledged democracy. So they knew that this moment is coming, and I think they have been prepared for it. They were preparing for it. Just a few days ago, there was a massive rally by protesters in various cities in Sudan demanding a transfer of power away from the military. So I do think that the military is not probably going to have an easy time. One must hope that they do not resort to violence, shooting, and which might lead to the death of innocent protesters. But very fluid situation. Like I said, but we're shooting this by the time the show comes out, and things might be very different. So a bit difficult to say, but nonetheless, a very important story to sort of keep track of.
Yeah. In the context of all of this, the overthrowing of al-Bashir and also the situation in terms of the economic situation in the Sudan and other things, can you give us a bit more background? Tell us what is leading to people coming out on the streets time and again?
Right. So the rule of al-Bashir was a tyrannic dictatorial rule. So people in 2008, the economic situation was bad. The civil liberty situation was horrible. People in 2018 started protests. By April, they had overthrown al-Bashir. So their concern, like in many countries, was that al-Bashir's regime's remnants were still in power. And these include, for instance, the general known as Hemeti, who controls the rapid security forces. They are apparently out on the streets right now. They're paramilitary forces which have a horrible record of human rights violations. So, or for that matter, Abdel Fattah al-Burhan, who is the leader of the establishment right now, who is also part of the old regime. So, what happens is somewhere in mid-2019, certain sections of the political establishment and the military sign an agreement, and which is how the civilian-military alliance comes to power. Now, the more radical sections of the protest movement were very concerned even at that time, because they felt that this was a compromise, that basically the civilian sections had legitimized the military by allowing them to come to power.
Share power.
So the structure was basically, there was something called a sovereignty council, which had representatives from both the civilian sections and the military. Abdel Fattah al-Burhan, the chief of the army, was the head of the Sovereignty Council. There was then there was of course the cabinet. There was supposed to be something called Legislative Council, which functioned as a parliament, and which would have been key to having proper democracy in the country, because that would have been a completely civilian institution. However, that institution was not set up despite multiple demands. So over time, what we saw was that increasingly the more radical sections of the protest movement, which had actually fueled a lot of the participation, they started growing disenchanted with what has been happening, and they've been pushing the civilian sections to enact the promises that were made 2 years ago in 2019 when this arrangement took place, which is that there would eventually be a full-fledged transfer to civilian government and the military would not be part of the government. So that process, there's been a lot of pressure from the protest groups, and the military over time has also, I think, come to realize that if this pressure continues, it is possible that civilian government might actually take over. So this might also be a preventive strike by the military to ensure that that process is not completed. So one key thing, for instance, is that in recent times, certain sections which are associated with Bashir, they have been called a front for Bashir, were protesting, asking the military to take over. Saying that to save Sudan, the military had to take over power again. Now, this was widely seen as an attempt by the military and former sections of the regime to sort of, try to reverse the process of the past 2 years. So that is why it is a very tense situation, because on the one hand, we had these groups doing a sit-in in Khartoum and, pretending to be neutral, calling for the military to take over as though, there was no connection at all. And on the other hand, we had the more radical sections which are demanding that the promises of the revolution, the promises of 2019 be fulfilled. And these promises were obtained after a lot of violence and bloodshed in which people lost their lives. The military killed people. Right. So right now, like I said, it's tough to say which of these forces is at the ascendant. Our sources do tell us, however, that there is the tendency in media reporting seems to be called the coup a done deal, as though the military has taken over. They feel that this is not that easy, and that the protests are going to be stronger.
And it's a ground up movement, I guess. So plenty of support for against this coup attempt. We will, of course, on People's Dispatch keep covering this story and bring you updates as and when they unfold, the things in Sudan unfold. But we're talking now about Palestine, a country which comes up regularly on the show because of Israel's actions. And on Friday, Israel has once again brought the story up by branding 6 Palestinian human rights organizations as terrorist groups. Some of these organizations have been working for decades and play a vital role in chronicling the extent of human rights violations in the occupied territories, of course. Some of them even receive funds from Western agencies. The announcement has shocked governments and human rights groups across the world, many of whom have condemned it. Prashant, what are these organizations and why are they facing this crackdown?
Right. I mean, Siddhant, if you take a look at any media coverage of Palestine in most media outlets across the world, there are very strong chances that you will find one of these organizations quoted, because these are some of the biggest, most powerful, prominent human rights organizations in the region. For instance, there is Al-Haq, which has been doing a huge amount of work in human rights, one of the oldest groups in Palestine. There is Adamir, which does invaluable work for those who are detained, provides them free legal service. There's the Union of Agriculture Workers Committee, the Union of Women's Committees, which have played a huge role in mobilizing Palestinian women and in the feminist movement in Palestine. So all these groups are, these are not, the Israeli government has said that these groups are associated with the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine, which is a political party, and which it calls terrorist. So it has said that these groups are a front for the PFLP, these groups provide funding for the PFLP, etc., without providing any evidence of all these. The absurdity of these charges, like I said, stems from the fact that you don't have to be pro-Palestine to know these organizations. Even media outlets extremely critical, or sources extremely critical of the Palestinian struggle, which are pro-Israel, consider these as legitimate, respectable organizations. So that says a lot. But the important thing to note is that these organizations are those which actually play a vital role in the day-to-day resistance of the Palestinian people to Israeli occupation. And that's very important to note, because they chronicle what is often, some of the details which are often kind of ignored, the day-to-day dynamics of the struggle, of the suffering the people are facing, and how they're resisting, both of these. For instance, Palestinian prisoners. Other media provides invaluable information about the plight of these prisoners, but also the resistance they take through hunger strikes, through protests, how they're unwilling to accept Israeli brutality in the prisons in which Palestinians are placed. So for that matter, the Union of Agricultural Work Committees or the women's committees, again, very, very important, roles they played in these areas in occupied Palestine. And of course, we do know that the PFLP itself, while it does have an armed wing, it is an integral part of the Palestinian struggle. It is a part of the Palestinian Liberation Organization. Its members too have been persecuted, and really they have had to suffer a lot. A recent example is this former legislator from the PFLP, Khalida Jarrar, who was in jail for many, many months. When her daughter died, she was not even allowed to come out and attend the funeral. And there were no real charges. So the charges were all extremely vague. Again, supporting a terrorist organization is a really, really vague charge.
Yeah.
And when you apply it to such prominent human rights organization, it really shows the extent to which Israel is attacking. There's no other word for it. Is attacking even in so-called peacetime.
Yeah.
Is attacking the Palestinian people and their rights.
Yeah. So in that context, what seems to be your understanding, or what is your understanding of Israel's plan in all of this?
So it's a good question, because what Israel is trying to do is basically, for lack of a better word, criminalize every aspect of Palestinian society, right? So that's really that seems to be the basic operational principle here, that any expression of Palestinian identity in the form of protests, in the form of celebrations, in the form of commemorations, in the form of organization, all of these have to be criminalized. That really seems to be the agenda here, because we've talked about this before. One of Israel's most significant strategies is to change the facts on the ground, right? So now there are, for instance, many media reports have said that even the United States was taken aback by this decision. And for that matter, that European countries were taken aback. Now, Israel knows that the United States and these European countries are not going to stop their support to Israel because of these reasons.
Yeah.
So what it is doing is basically using this support to change the facts on the ground by criminalizing large aspects of Palestinian life. And the attempt, this is nothing new. For instance, another key organization which works for prisoners, Samidun, was similarly targeted. In addition to these committees I talked, there's the Union of Palestinian Health Workers Committees, whose director Shata Odeh remains in jail. She's been in jail for many months now. Again, no clarity on why a medical professional who was working during COVID on the ground has been imprisoned. Again, very vague charges, supporting terrorist organizations, etc., etc. So this has become a catch-all term for the Israeli establishment, for the Israeli state, to brand Palestinians as a whole. And their attempt is basically to concretize these facts so that say funding, for instance, comes down for them, or international recognition comes down for them, and in various ways through this process they're able to hide the Palestinian struggle, or conceal the Palestinian struggle, which is probably at its peak right now. It's been many, many decades since the struggle was so strong, and Israel knows that beyond a point it is very difficult to continuously face the struggle. So their solution seems to be just to, like I said, criminalize it. So we have instances like in May this year when they bombed Gaza for 11 days, but this is the relatively silent side of occupation, as you would call it. I mean, it's not. It happens through statements, it happens through designations. For instance, now they can attack the offices of these organizations at any point of time, seize documents, prevent their personnel from functioning, maybe even arrest them. So all of this is, so that's really the strategy here. The attempt is really to completely,
silence,
delegitimize Palestinian social life, because that's the important thing here.
While also giving themselves some kind of legal framework in which to do the whole thing.
Exactly. So the idea is that anything Palestinians do has to be, as a group, as a community, has to be delegitimized. Israel is fine with Palestinians as just subjects. That's all, that's all they're willing to take. But the moment people organize, the moment people do something, they resist. The moment people do what any humans across the world do, that has to be delegitimized, so that the international community also slowly begins to accept it. So that really seems to be Israel's point.
Yeah, and also demonstrative, I guess, of how much the Israeli establishment controls the narrative in that sense, especially for a wider global audience.
Exactly.
We're moving on now to another developing story about a diplomatic confrontation. Turkey has declared that the ambassadors of 10 countries, including those from the US, Germany, and France, be declared persona non grata. It follows a statement from the envoys calling for the urgent release of activist Usman Kavala. He's been in jail for more than 4 years over protests and a coup attempt, although he has not been convicted of either. This move is often a precursor to governments removing diplomatic status and could result in expulsion or withdrawal of recognition of envoys. Prashant, strong response from Turkey. Could you first tell us who Mr. Kavala is and why he's in jail?
Interesting that we're talking about Turkey immediately after Palestine, because what Turkey has done is very similar, is pretty much in the from the Israeli playbook, playbook of many other countries, including India, even the United States for that matter, which is to brand anybody who's uncomfortable for you in various ways as a terrorist, in some senses as supporting the terrorist organization or planning to overthrow the government, sedition. These are all catch-all terms which have lost their meaning right now because they're just slapped on anybody who's criticizes the government. Osman Kavala also a very good example of that, because he first was accused of masterminding the 2013 Gazi protests, which began with a small park, but over time it became a movement which represented the aspirations of the Turkish people. It was massive, something on the lines of Occupy Wall Street maybe, but even more powerful in terms of the organization.
Right.
So this movement was a huge threat. I mean, Erdogan, the leader of Turkey, saw this as a huge threat, and there was a crackdown on this. So from that time onwards, there's been this attempt to sort of find the masterminds, paint it as some kind of conspiracy, which is really the ball game over here. That
Right.
When there is a popular protest against you as a leader, try to frame it as the act of a few individuals who fooled gullible people into coming out on the streets and doing that. So it cannot be that the people were are really unhappy and came out spontaneously.
Right.
There was organization, of course,
Yeah.
but the fact that the narrative is painted this way is always an attempt to make it the fault of 2 or 3 malcontented individuals who can then be targeted and persecuted. So Kavala was one of those people. The interesting thing is that in 2019 he was acquitted of those charges, and within hours he was arrested again because of the fact that in 2016 there was a coup in Turkey. Erdogan has blamed Fethullah Gulen, who is the leader of a sect based in the United States, for the coup. It was a pretty serious coup. Over 200 people died. There was a bit of uncertainty whether Erdogan would even be able to continue, but he did. And since then, the coup has again been another reason to similarly crack down on civil society, to similarly crack down on activists. So Osman Kavala, who was acquitted of any kind of criminality for the 2013 Gazi protests, suddenly was rearrested as now one of the masterminds or the authors or conspirators behind the 2016 coup. And he continues to be in jail. Now, the important thing is a number of courts have declared there is really no evidence. In fact, I think one has even said that he should be given compensation.
Right.
But the fact remains that Kavala remains in prison. Now, it's an open question as to why the Western countries released a statement demanding his freedom. Like we talked about on this show many times, the record of all these countries is nowhere great on similar lines.
Sure.
The US has Guantanamo Bay, for instance, where recently people are being released after decades. But nonetheless, it is probably a larger game in a geopolitical chessboard. It's kind of pressure tactic. You push Turkey because Turkey is right now a very sensitive country at a very key position in the global framework. So it's probably that rather than any concern for human rights or human dignity that propelled that statement.
Right.
But we can, I think, safely keep that aside and look at the issue itself, which is that Turkey has been seeing a massive wave of repression against anybody associated with the opposition.
Right. So Erdogan also taking singular sort of offense, it seems, to this particular call for the release of Kavala. But this is by no means an isolated incident.
Absolutely. For instance, a very good example is Salahuddin Demirtas, who was actually a presidential candidate. He contested for the presidency from jail. He was leader of the People's Democratic Party, the HDP, one of the few pro-Kurdish parties in Turkey. They have a very powerful relationship with the Kurdish people. On the other hand, what the Turkish state has done is accused the HDP of having links with the banned PKK, the Kurdish Workers' Party of Abdullah Öcalan. And so there's been a massive crackdown on the HDP for many, many years now. In fact, I think even now there is an attempt by the Turkish establishment to ban that party.
Right.
And it's important to note that pro-Kurdish parties have been banned relentlessly over the years, even before Erdogan came to power and while Erdogan has been in power. So Demirtas was arrested for again, another reason. There were protests in 2016 after an attack on Kobani. So, there were protests, and due to that, there was firing on the protesters, and due to that reason, Demirtas has been arrested and has been in jail for many years. There are reports that he might get bail soon, but he has been in jail for quite some time. And many others, for instance, I think the Demirtas trial itself involves at least another 107 members of the HDP. So this is of course one party which has been facing a lot of pressure, and which is relatively more to the left. There are even centrist parties. Their mayors of various cities have been dismissed. Their number of members of parliament have had their immunity revoked as part of the preconditions for starting legal proceedings against them. So, in broadly, Erdogan has unleashed a wave of crackdowns against the opposition across the country.
Right.
And on the other hand, there's also been a rise in vigilantism. Turkey facing a lot of socio-economic problems over the past few years, increasing crime on women, horrible declining economy. At this point of time, what the AKP, the party of Erdogan, is doing is basically, positing enemies of the state, so to speak, and creating enemies of the state, and then directing popular anger against them. So, like I said, a very common strategy right now in many parts of the world. We are seeing these enemies of the state cropping up out of nowhere in so many of these states.
Yeah.
But this is exactly what is happening right now in Turkey. So, like you said, Osman Kavala''s case, not at all an isolated one at all. Many other prominent politicians also facing a similar situation. Situation is equally bad on the ground as well.
Right. And of course, this is also something that is happening on the ground currently and developing.
Right.
And we'll see whether it's just showmanship or brinksmanship, or whether it actually amounts to something, or what it amounts to.
Right.
But now, and finally, this is our final bit for today's show. I'm going to be boldly going where at least I have never gone before, which is to try and engage Prashant in a conversation around sport. We're talking about the ICC T20 World Cup of Cricket, which is currently underway in the UAE. Last evening, India played Pakistan in the opening fixture for each of these countries, and Pakistan won the game by a massive 10-wicket margin. It's the first time a Pakistan side has beaten India in any sort of cricket World Cup. But more than what happened on the pitch, it's the Indians' decision to take a knee in a supposed show of solidarity with the Black Lives Matter movement, that was focus of much of the post-match conversation. Prashant, a wide range of public persons in India coming out and sort of pointing to the hypocrisy of the Indian cricket team, which is made up of, as we know, and I'm not sure if the audience is aware, but these are people who are treated almost as celebrities, of course, but demigod status in India. And they have a history of being silent on issues when that matter to the people of that country. What's your take on what's going on?
Good question, Siddhant. You probably know more about this than I do, but I actually just randomly by chance came across a photo and was just struck by, like you said, the sheer hypocrisy of what we saw. And India is a country which is facing a lot of crisis right now, and there is, and especially over the past years, since the Narendra Modi government has been in power, especially since 2019, the second term.
Yeah.
And there have been social crises in Kashmir, for instance. The the protests against the Citizenship Amendment Bill, which shook the country. Hundreds of protest sites took place across the country. The farmers' protest, which has been going on for almost a year.
Yeah.
And at each of these moments, people have kind of wondered, that where are our cricketers? Where are our cricket stars who in many ways embody the aspirations, the hopes, the dreams of so many people. Like you said, cricketers are seen as demigods because in some ways because cricket is such a popular sport in India. And more importantly, many of these people have come from difficult backgrounds. Many of them have struggled, and they have reached a huge amount of success. They're seen as role models for very good reason, because many of their stories are really inspirational.
Yeah.
On the other hand, what we have seen is that there's been, like you said, a massive amount of silence on any and every social issue.
Yeah.
Now, you can attribute this to the fact that cricket in India is very closely connected with the political establishment.
Yeah.
As we know, the son of India's Home Minister basically runs cricket in India, for lack of better words. So, fine, you get that. That many of them are scared to talk about stuff. So, when you see something like this, when you say, we're all for solidarity for Black Lives Matters. In fact, sportspersons have been at the forefront of these gestures, taking the knee. It has had a very powerful, inspirational meaning for many of us who watch and follow sport.
Yeah.
On the other hand, I think people associated with the movement have always warned that taking the knee in support of Black Lives Matter can be reduced to a very symbolic and very hypocritical gesture.
yeah.
Because in some
Purely
ways,
performative.
it is so easy to do, point one. And you don't have to really, examine your own past record. You don't have to talk about any of your internal inconsistencies. You can just proclaim solidarity. And it's a memorable gesture, so it's widely photographed, widely covered. Everyone gets to see you as some kind of progressive person. So this seems to be something like that. I mean, I don't know if it was some PR executive's idea of...
Yeah, in fact, the conversation that what we learned from the team was that it was communication that was received from, up the chain of command,
Right.
and then the players discussed it, and everyone sort of agreed that yes.
Right. So it's, I think it's not surprising that people, for instance, who have been part of some of these struggles in India are not at all amused by these gestures, because I think time and again, when there's so much social media hate against people who protest, when top leaders of the government and the ruling party have unleashed vitriolic, venom, basically, for lack of a better word, against people who have protested. Not even support, even subtle solidarity from some of these cricketers would have maybe made a huge difference, would have made people think that, okay, maybe there's something. But they all stayed silent. Some of them, in fact, some of the retired cricketers, in fact, maybe sportspersons, in fact, standing by the government and, supporting the government narrative on this rather than the side of people who are protesting.
Right.
So we've seen a glorious history of sportspersons representing radical causes, progressive causes, inspiring causes.
Yeah.
This definitely not it.
Not one of them, for sure. And I think one of the most sort of things that stand out the most for me is how even when it comes to their own fraternity, there's a very marked silence.
Exactly.
In fact, Mohammad Shami, one of the members of the team that played yesterday, was on the receiving end of horrific abuse online after the match, simply because of the community that he comes from and the religion that he chooses to follow. So a lot of questions there for these Indian superstars. But that does it for us on this episode of Daily Debrief. Thank you all for watching, and follow us on peoplesdispatch.org in all our social media channels. We'll see you again tomorrow, same time, same place. Goodbye.